John, you have taught and written on issues of morality and ethics and value systems in the Bible. Joshua is one of the hardest cases in the whole thing, isn't it? Because cherem is, I think, from our current viewpoint, pretty indefensible, and yet here it is as almost the primary divinely ordained sort of directive for Israel.
Well, the reason I came to write about it is that right about 20 years ago, I happened to be president of the Society of Biblical Literature.
Brag.
And just before the annual meeting in September, there was an incident in New York on 9/11.
Uh-huh.
And there was suddenly, this became a very hot topic. And there was an awful lot of denunciation of the barbarity of Islam as sanctioning violence. And it led me to go back and look at what's our own record on this. Mm. And of course, this is also part of the something that was inherited also by Islam. But right back here, I think, before we go off denouncing other people for their violence, we ought to see what role does that play in our own system. And it plays a very troubling one, I think.
And so what do you make, not to push maybe on a difficult question, but what in your mind is, if there is one, any difference between a biblical system that says our God commanded us or commands us to wipe out off the face of the planet people whose religious systems are different from ours in such a way that their very existence is a threat to our religious system. When I say it in really generic terms like that, it sounds like, it's just fundamentalism, right? A sort of a violent fundamentalism that's not Islamic or Christian or of any other. Is that what this is? Have you found a way of nuancing this such that it does better work?
Is your question, have I found a way of redeeming the story of the conquest?
Yeah, not only that, but should we be finding a way of redeeming the story of the conquest?
Well, you see, I would tend to say we should not. This seems to be something that's fundamentally wrong. Now, before we get carried away at how wrong it is, we should also recognize that we're all beneficiaries of such a system. Mm. Because without this in the Bible, you have no Israel. I think somebody made the point about the Exodus being a great story of liberation. But it would have been no good if they didn't have somewhere to go.
Right.
And unfortunately, there were other people in the land. So you have an inherent ambiguity built in. We can all feel good about the liberation of the slaves out of Egypt. But there is this underside to it of what then happens afterwards. Of course, in this country, which has been one of the main places where the story of the conquest was applied, mm-hmm. Again, we're all either ourselves immigrants or descendants of immigrants and beneficiaries of a colonial system. So there's no innocence in this. But nonetheless, I think it's important to recognize that there's something fundamentally wrong with it. And I very much object to the attempts to explain away the moral problem of the conquest.
So I'm glad that you brought up the particularly American version of this.
Yeah.
Because this is something that was conceptually sort of baked in from the moment that the Pilgrims said, we're going off on our own exodus across the sea.
Yeah.
And we're coming to this new world. We're leaving behind the Egypt and the Pharaoh of the religious oppression, and we're coming to this new world, to the new promised land, where there were the new Canaanites, inhabitants here, and they struggled a little bit. They struggled. The first settlers, the first colonial settlers, did struggle with the moral problem. Should we simply wipe them out, as Joshua did? Some people said they could only do that because they had explicit divine command to do so,
Yes.
and we don't. And so they were arguing against. For better or worse, when the native population became sick with smallpox and other diseases that had been brought over, this was seen as a divine act that sort of gave some permission for the colonial act. I think that for my part, it is really important and useful when we tell the story, and this happens, this every year for me at Passover, right? We tell the story of the Exodus, and it's all celebration, and we end the story at, hooray, we left, freedom.
Yeah.
But a couple of books on, and we're slaughtering innocent, men, women, and children, and animals, and cutting down. Terrible, terrible things.
Yeah.
The coin flips pretty fast there, I think.
Yeah. Does it matter that this may never have happened?
It's a real. I used to teach it this way. I used to say, in an attempt to do a little bit of reclamation or redemption, or at least, if not of redemption, at least of understanding. Right? How can we understand that this is here? And I would say things like, well, A, historically it never happened. Like B, the text is very clear that it should only happen at that one place and time in history. Right? It is only during the conquest, only in the past. And the text makes no makes no rules about how to do this moving forward when you conquer other peoples. And I said, and so what I think is we're seeing here, as I've sort of said in these conversations, is we're just seeing an attempt to make sense of the absence of the people, and also perhaps to push some of the moral weight of this off of Israel and up onto God. We have stories about how we had no choice. How could we have done anything else? Did you see what happened to Achan? We had to do it. Is it more? Maybe it's morally problematic, but if I say that God made us do it, I've sort of solved that problem in a different way, perhaps. I used to do it that way. I've since stopped. I think for much the reason that you said, which is, I think we simply increasingly need to be grappling with the fact that the Bible is at times not in line with our, not redeemable. I think that's very hard for some people to come to terms with.
Yeah. Now, one of the ways in which people have traditionally tried to deal with it is to say that the Canaanites were so wicked. I think John Calvin had that argument. Even Albright, I think, said how the Canaanites were one of the most decadent civilizations. Canaanites weren't any more decadent than anybody else.
And certainly no more anything than the Israelites. I mean, who were, for the most part, indistinguishable from them. What you're seeing there, I think, is simply people rehashing precisely the villainization of the Canaanites that we see in the text. We see places in the Bible where it describes the Canaanites as sexually immoral, or as very prone to child sacrifice, or in all these ways that the Canaanites are cast as bad. But when you dig, even a tiny bit archaeologically, or even into the text, they were perfectly.
Now, I've also seen the argument made by a sometime friend of ours, who will not be identified, that the Bible is advancing here a moral view of history. The Canaanites are punished because they were sinners, and when the Israelites sin, they will be punished too.
Is that friend still John Calvin? Because that still sounds a lot like Calvin to me.
No, in fact, this friend converted to Catholicism. Now, does that work?
Again, how is that different? Especially when there's a real tension, right? The laws about obedience and about following. We've been talking about this whole time about ritual instruction and about following the laws. Yeah. Those laws are only in the Bible ever for Israel. Never in the Bible.
That's
Never in the
right,
Bible is
yes.
it assumed
Yeah.
that the
Yeah, yeah.
Ammonites or the Moabites or whoever should be sacrificing to Yahweh the way that the Israelites do. What is sin even
Yeah.
in that context? Again, I think that the demonization of the other
Yeah.
is a tool for probably simply for redeeming a text that people are unhappy with thinking of as morally wrong. I was going to say
Yeah.
problematic, but
now,
full out
but
wrong.
now the demonization of the other is actually going on here in the text.
Oh yeah.
And now another argument that I have seen made on this is that, the violence isn't the point. The point is how we should make a strong distinction. Preserve the distinctness of Israel and the contrast over with the way of life of the other people, although the contrast may not be particularly in evidence in this case. Again, any of that work? I sure don't think so.
No, and for the same reasons. Biblical exceptionalism
Yeah.
shows itself in lots of different
Yeah.
ways and places, and this is just another one of them.
So what then are we left with? Why in fact, as you've made the point several times, they wanted to get people to keep the law.
Mm.
Okay, this is a maybe heavy-handed way of doing it by telling this kind of story. But now, there are other ways maybe you could tell stories about how people need to keep the law without slaughtering all the neighbors. There is also an attempt here, I think, to promote. Now, there is certainly kind of aggressive distinction of Israel from its neighbors. There is the desire to build a very different identity, but to do so in a way that's especially hostile and especially destructive. And why that?
So the way that I have come to think about this, certainly recently, is that what we look at and see as a very externally focused animosity, us, Israel, against all of these other peoples with all their other terrible beliefs that we have to fight against. I have come to suspect that much of that is actually an externalization of an internal Israelite debate.
Yeah.
That is, everything you just said about Israelites wanting to promote a very strong identity in the face of, I think that's true of some Israelites, are Deuteronomistically minded, perhaps, who said the right way to do this is you worship in Jerusalem and you don't do other cults and you obey the laws. And they looked around at the rest of Israel and thought, not so many people are doing this. How do we make clear that to not follow Yahweh the way we say is it's as if you're worshiping a foreign god altogether. And, in Deuteronomy, where this comes from, the cherem comes up in two different places. One is when you're conquering the foreigners and destroying them. And the other is, if you should see anyone among you in your territories who says, come, let us go worship other gods. Cherem. And so I think those two things aren't unrelated. I think that there's a lot of, and I think that this is something that, even if it is not explicit, is picked up in the way that people read the stories in Joshua, because it's not always purely externally minded. When people say we have to wipe out the infidels and the unbelievers and the heretics, right? We have to do this sort of cleansing that is a Joshua-style cherem-like cleansing. I think that is just as often, internal to religions and faiths as it is external.
Does that in any way lessen its problematic nature?
Of course not.
Yeah. No, it just means, it locates it somewhere else.
Yeah.
But I think it's the problem, it's the attitude that's the problem. Also, I think you touched on the argument that has often been made, and made, I think, for good reason. It's made, for example, in Modern Israel by Moshe Greenberg, that these laws only apply to the initial generation. So you have no warrant to extend them now and to treat the Palestinians as Canaanites. Fair enough, but that, I think, implies that they were holy and just and good in their original setting.
Yeah.
And I think one has to recognize, no, they weren't. You know, this is sinful humanity. And a lot of the appeal of the Bible is not that it holds up great ideals for us to emulate, but it shows us how awful we are. And I think, you know, we shouldn't just externalize it and say this doesn't apply to us, because what makes this scripture, in a way, is it is our story. But it tells you you can't just take that and run with it.